everyone to our We Have an Evaluator, Now What session. We're so glad that you decided to join us today. We actually just learned that you cannot see us while we're sharing the presentation, so we thought we would start on camera to introduce ourselves so you can see our faces while we're telling you who we are, and then we'll get into our presentation. So my name is Miranda Cairns. I'm part of the OIE TA team, but I mainly work kind of behind the scenes. So I'm excited to be able to come out today and actually talk to you and interact with you. My background is started out in teaching and then kind of moved into program evaluation. I've worked as an internal evaluator for a small not-for-profit companies, as well as an external evaluator, working with a variety of different types of organizations and programs. And for the past 3 years, our team provided support to the Knowledge Ed grantees, and I actually conducted a sort of internal evaluation of our own technical assistance efforts. So that was a really kind of unique and rewarding experience for me, and helped me learn a lot about that program. I even had the very wonderful opportunity to visit some of them and do some observations. So I'm looking forward to talking to all of you today, and I'll pass it over to Sherry.
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Sherry Laver. So glad that you can make it this afternoon and join us. And I hope you'll stick around later on for our networking session, because I so love to hear everybody else's ideas and comments. Then it becomes a two-way street instead of a one-way street. So I've been a professional evaluator for most of my career, and I've also taught at the University of Rochester, program evaluation methods and research methods to doctoral students there, and very much enjoyed all the myriad of projects that people were working on and trying to, evaluate using many, many different methods. I've always been really curious, like what works, for whom, why does it work, how can we make it better? I mean, that's a driving, passion in my life. And I like to think about cost effectiveness too. As a taxpayer, I like to think about what we're paying for and what we're making great use of. So I hope that you'll enjoy this session today about how to best use your evaluator to help support your program team in program improvement. And now I'll pass it over to Dr. Faircloth.
So good afternoon. My name is Susan Faircloth, and I am professor and director of the School of Education at Colorado State University. Before I say just a little bit about myself, I'd like to start out by acknowledging the land on which I am joining this presentation or session from. So my institution, Colorado State University, is located on the traditional homelands of the Ute Mountain, the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. And I give that recognition or acknowledgement for a couple of reasons. One is because I am also an American Indian person myself. My tribe is Kahari, and it's located in the southeastern part of North Carolina, hence my deeply southern accent. And second, I like to give that acknowledgement because in addition to being a professor, an educator, and an Indigenous person, I'm also the mother of an 11-year-old. Her name is Journey. And we adopted Journey when she was a day old from the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation out of Oklahoma. And so being able to do this work that I'm most passionate about, work that has the potential to impact the education and life outcomes of American Indian and Alaska Native students, is both professionally important to me, but it's also personally important, particularly given that I'm the mother of a young one, and that the work that I do and the place in which I do this work is located on the traditional homelands of my daughter's people of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. And so I think particularly as we talk about evaluation today, one of the things that I'll talk about is the importance of people and of place and of history of land, and how that plays into the work that we do and how we evaluate or assess the effectiveness or impact of that work. And then I'll end by saying, in addition to my work at the university and as a mother and an Indigenous person, I have over 20 years of experience in working in Indigenous education. I'm also the product of an Indian education program in my elementary, middle school, and high school years. I went on to work with an Indian education program in an urban school district. And then after that, I went on to earn my master's and doctoral degrees through programs that were sponsored by the Office of Indian Education and the U.S. Department of Ed and then later went on to direct personnel preparation grants that came out of the Office of Indian Education, and to serve as an evaluator and as a reviewer of proposals. So a lot of what I'll talk about today is based on not my experience primarily as an evaluator, but my experience having both gone through and experienced these types of programs, having written grants, and then having worked as a project director. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. We are thrilled to have her with us. As you can tell, she has a wealth of experience to share. So we'll hear from her some more later. I am going to get us started by sharing our presentation. And after a quick disclaimer, we'll be right back.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
Okay, and then I will skip over our introduction since we did those on camera so you could see us. And then I'm going to pass it to Sherry to get us started.
That's right. Well, we're going to spend, some good time today talking directly with Dr. Faircloth about her work, which I think you're going to find really interesting. So the goals of this session are to communicate the benefits of evaluation, to consider the factors when you're selecting an evaluator, paying someone to support your work, and then finally, how to collaborate with that evaluator, whether that person might be internal or external, to determine an evaluation plan that is going to meet your needs. So we look forward to diving right in. I'd like to start with a poll. So if you go over to Pathable, next to the chat area, if you click on the word polls, your first poll will come up. What is your role? And if you click on the vote button, you'll get to see your choices. We'd love to learn just a little bit more about you. Are you a project director, external evaluator, etc.? So a few of you are logging in with your answers. It looks like thus far we've got about 33% of you are project directors. We've got some external and internal evaluators and some program implementation leaders, and then some others. A little bit of mix of everything. Thank you, everybody. That just helps us get a little bit of sense. And if there are evaluators in the audience, although this session is geared primarily towards the project leaders and staff to help them understand the evaluation process and tips for working with you as their evaluator, we still believe that you can benefit from this session, and you're very welcome here. Okay, so next, I'm going to ask you to answer our next poll, and it is, which statement best describes your experience with evaluation? So if you click on your vote button and choose an answer, we'll get a decent sense of where you're coming from. If you have very little experience, some experience, fairly experienced, or have expertise. All right, we've got some people with good amount of experience today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really going to depend upon you in the chat box to be offering tips and supporting, our more novice level leaders who are just learning how to work with evaluators effectively. So thank you very much. So next, let's just take a look at a very traditional definition of program evaluation. And this is Michael Quinn Patton. He's a famous evaluator. And this definition of program evaluation was used in the Center for Disease Control's manual. So it's the systematic collection of information about the activities, characteristics, and outcomes of programs to make judgments about the program, improve program effectiveness and or inform decisions about future program development. So, and if you have comments about that definition, if you think it should be expanded, if you have critique of it, throw it in the chat box. We'll be taking a look at that as we move along. I'd love your thoughtful critique. And now I wanted to address a little bit more about Indigenous evaluation. And this excerpt comes from a member of our advisory committee. So let me just read the comment at the top on the PowerPoint. So Indigenous evaluation, the integration of program implementation with evaluation contributes to integrity or truth making. And this comes from a weaving the basket metaphor that Eric Jolly uses, and it was in a book by Joan LaFrance and Richard Nichols. So I'm going to just sit back and relax for a minute, because I'm going to tell the story that Dr. Eric Jolly uses, and this is his grandmother's story, and he's given us permission to share it today. So why is a basket a metaphor for Indigenous evaluation? So among the Cherokee, the making of a basket is a journey through which lessons are learned about life and spirit. The making of the basket begins by interweaving two pairs of thin honeysuckle vines into a square or cross. This forms the base of the basket. This squared cross symbolizes the four directions and the four elements of all creation: the Great Spirit, Mother Earth and her gifts, animal life, and all humanity. On the journey of life, this represents the beginning of spiritual awareness. Additional pairs of vines are woven, and together with the original crossed set of vines, they begin to form interwoven triangles that give shape to the basket. This interconnectedness symbolizes a deeper awareness, the working together of the Great Spirit with all humanity, the earth, and animals. The basket maker continues, weaving in more vines to form a set of concentric circles. This represents an even higher level of spiritual awareness, the interconnection of all things with the Creator. We are all related and one with the Creator. As the basket maker continues weaving, the basket forms an inner wall interlaced with an outer wall. It is the tension between these two walls that gives strength to the basket. For the basket maker, this strength from the tension between the two walls also gives the basket its integrity, for a strong basket is a useful basket. So using this metaphor as a way to view evaluation, we see the program as a journey of learning. The inner wall of the basket is program implementation. The outer wall is the evaluation of it. Together, these two combine to form a tension that enables the program to learn, improve, and strengthen. In basket making, it's important to have balance all around the basket. The basket maker must continually turn the basket as he or she works to inspect for balance and evenness. Similarly, by looking at our programs from multiple perspectives through evaluation, we also seek to create a more perfect product, one that balances our understanding of how goals connect to activities and results. In this sense, the evaluation focuses on learning throughout our work. We continually examine as we create and implement the program, and we do not wait until the end of the program to conduct the evaluation. We must continue to look at our programs as they unfold so that we can render judgment and make decisions about how to ensure that the program is successful. So I hope you enjoyed that metaphor that Dr. Eric Jolly shared about his grandmother's story. And as we talk about the evaluation process today, we encourage you to keep in mind that it is flexible and should be responsive to difference. And that could mean difference among your cultures, your context, your community stakeholders, and your needs. Next, I'd like to just introduce you, or maybe reintroduce you to two forms of evaluation: process evaluation and outcome evaluation. Process evaluations focus on assessing whether the program is operating as intended. This can be particularly useful for new programs. If you design your program to achieve specific goals, but do not implement it as it was designed, then it is unlikely to result in the intended outcomes. And so this is the importance of implementation fidelity. For example, if you're implementing an evidence-based program that students are supposed to participate in for 60 minutes per day, but due to transition or other activities, they're only getting 30 minutes, this could certainly affect your program outcomes. So this brings us to the next type of evaluation, outcome evaluation. An outcome evaluation refers to the evaluation of the result or the outcome of a program implemented to producing change. So let's just think about an example from everyday life. So let's say I join a weight loss online program with the intention of losing 10 pounds. So I enjoy using the app. I learn more about eating more nutritious foods. I get daily tips on the app, reminding me to become more active. I'm connecting with other participants. I'm getting a lot of enjoyment and support from that. And the entire process I felt was enjoyable, and I really felt that I learned a lot. And at the end of my 6 weeks, perhaps, I realized that I did not lose any weight as a result of my participation. So I may have learned a lot about nutrition. I may have exercised more, but I did not lose weight as a result. So this could have been the result of perhaps, eating more calories than I burned on a daily basis, whether or not they were nutritious foods or not. So that program may not be achieving its objectives, although, I was quite happy and satisfied with the program as it was operating and as planned. So just trying to think about how things, can, appeal to an audience and feel good and be satisfactory to them, but still not quite lead to the outcome. And that makes me want to dive in deeper and figure out why. So that's just one form of evaluation. We have so many different types. We can't get into them all today, but we are going to dive a little bit into some of the youth evaluation that we think is so interesting and informative. But right now we're going to launch another poll because I'd like to learn more about what your goals are for evaluation in your programs as it relates to your OIE grant. So if you go over to your poll box, you'll see that you've got a number of choices. Everything from collecting and reporting data for your APRs, assessing progress towards objectives, identifying your strengths, sharing information with stakeholders, etc. So I'd love to see some of your answers. What do you think is most important as you're evaluating your programs? Certainly APR, right? That's something we must do. So that's clearly important. But others of you, when I'm looking at your poll responses, really want to identify program strengths. That's very important. You want to make sure you're meeting your objectives. And you want to tell your story. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm going to pass it on over to Miranda now.
Thanks, Sherry. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why I do program evaluation. And before I share my thoughts, I'd like to hear yours. So if you can head back over to the chat box and share why you think program evaluation is important. What does it tell us? What kinds of questions can evaluation help us answer? I'll give you a minute to think about and share your ideas in the chat box. Chris had some good questions. Are we doing what we said we would do? Is it making a difference? Marian adds, what is working well and what areas need to be changed? Allison says evaluation allows you to explore what did or did not work and why, which allows leadership to determine what to fund or not. That's, I think, an important point, deciding where to use resources. Ken adds, are we following the program narrative? Shauna says, program effectiveness and Indigenous education excellent. All great answers and right aligned with what I'm thinking. So what is working? What is not working? What are our strengths? What intended and unintended outcomes have we seen? Things may happen that you weren't necessarily expecting to happen, and those could be positive or negative things. And how can we improve? If you joined us for our previous session, we really narrowed in on the continuous improvement process. And now in this section, we're going to review evaluation as a more holistic process. So evaluation is not just a compliance check. I think it can often be seen as that way, especially if you are using an external evaluator. But there are a lot of other benefits to it. As many of you have commented on, finding out what works and what doesn't work can be really valuable. This can help you decide how to focus your resources. We all know that we have limited resources, and this can help you decide where to focus them to have the greatest impact. It can also help you build evidence of effectiveness. A lot of times we know our programs have positive impacts anecdotally. You know, we work with students and we see the positive impacts that they're experiencing, but being able to really prove that and actually demonstrate the magnitude of those impacts can be very powerful. If you have meaningful data that show your program is effective at producing desired outcomes, that can help you create stakeholder and community buy-in. And as Allison was alluding to, attract partners and funding sources. So it can also help support the long-term sustainability of your program to be able to build that evidence of effectiveness. It can also help improve relationships. A lot of evaluations include input from participants and other stakeholders, such as staff and students, and listening to people, not just listening to them, but really listening and then using their feedback to make adjustments and improvements and inform your program design can improve their satisfaction and really make them feel valued. And then lastly, contributing knowledge to the field. Evaluation has the potential to not only benefit your program, but other programs. Contributing evidence of effectiveness to the field can help other programs learn from you and improve as well. So let's think a little bit about the different audiences of evaluation. Evaluation can have different purposes or uses for different audiences. First, we have program staff. Evaluation can help your staff understand the program better, serving both accountability and improvement purposes. Program staff might want to know the answers to questions such as, how can we improve implementation? Is our program reaching the target audience? Was the program implemented as intended? Did the program achieve its intended outcomes? If there are multiple sites, did some perform better than others? And if so, why? And what are the challenges to implementation? Evaluation can also help community members learn more about your program and provide accountability and create buy-in. Community members might want to know, is the program meeting our community's needs? What is the program accomplishing? Then, as we alluded to with reporting, we also have the federal government, or specifically the Office of Indian Education, as an audience. For this audience, you might first think about accountability, and although this does serve a purpose, it can also help inform policy decisions. This audience might want to know answers to questions like, did the program achieve its intended outcomes? How did the program contribute to our strategic goals? Is the program cost effective? Is the strategy viable? And then also the larger field. Evaluation contributes knowledge to the larger field of education. It tells these people might want to know, who does the program serve? In what context is this program most effective? Thinking about, can this be transferred to different contexts? What can we take from it? Did the program achieve its intended goals? How does the program fit with other improvement efforts and initiatives? So it's important to think about who our audience is going to be. Next, let's think about the role of evaluators, because they can serve multiple roles, and thinking about which role or roles you want yours to serve can also help you when you're selecting one. Evaluators can act as researchers, collecting, analyzing data and reporting findings. They can serve as auditors in a sense, ensuring adherence to your program design, measuring fidelity of implementation. And they can also act as coaches and facilitators, really helping you reflect on the findings and understand how to act on them. So I'd like to ask you to head back over to the polls and tell me which statement best describes your relationship with your evaluator. Are they really a core part of your program team and are involved in meetings and events? Do you meet with them frequently, but they're not really a part of your larger program team? Do you mainly talk about APR data, or are you just starting out and you don't know yet? So if you'll head over to that poll tab and take that, it'll help us get some more information about your current relationship with your evaluator. Right now, I'm seeing the majority are saying that your evaluator are part of your program team, which is wonderful. Also have about a third of people that are talking or meeting a few times per year, mainly to discuss data required for the APR, which we all understand is a priority. So it looks like we do have some differences in the level of involvement of your evaluator in your program. Everything from talking a few times a year, mainly about APR, to them being a real part of your program team. So I'd really like us to think of evaluation as a partnership. Having an external evaluator can help you see your program from an outside perspective, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your evaluator should be an outsider. Including your evaluator as part of your program team and communicating frequently will help ensure that the evaluation meets your program needs. And inviting your evaluator to program events can also help them gain a better understanding of your program, which will enable them to better tell your story. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry, who's going to talk to you a bit about factors to consider when selecting an evaluator and deciding whether they're going to be a good fit for you.
That's right, Miranda, thank you. So please put your thoughts in the chat box for me. What is an important factor that you consider when you're selecting an evaluator? And I'll give you a minute to think about it. So how do you select an evaluator? What are you looking for? I see having a positive relationship with that person, someone who you view as a partner. Thank you, Ken. Those are really good and very helpful. Anybody else? Linda, yes, the evaluator should know the community, definitely. Chris says, someone who can make the team think about how we reach our goals, provide options for ways to evaluate. Yes, someone who has that kind of flexibility. Amber says we should know the project participants and communities, especially our rural ones. Yes. Well, thank you. Those are really great responses. I appreciate it. This is, a big decision that we're going to make as program directors and planners. So here are some, questions to think about. What is the purpose of the evaluation? We sometimes have internal evaluators and external evaluators. An internal evaluator may have more knowledge of the program and other contextual factors, but an external evaluator can provide specific expertise and perhaps objectivity. Second, what is your staff's workload and your expertise? Do you and do they have the necessary knowledge, skills, and time to conduct an evaluation? Third, what are your available program resources? For example, if you want statistical analyses conducted as a result of the evaluation, do you have the necessary software? Consider that external evaluators are typically more expensive. And finally, would a hybrid approach work? You could consider having internal staff support data collection efforts led by an external evaluator. You can, mix and match depending upon what your need is. I also like to think about their training and experience, their background, whether they have formal training or not. Is this someone who's come highly recommended by others? Can you get examples of their work, examples of their reports? What is their capacity? Program evaluations, like everything else, takes a good amount of time and attention. So think about the scope of your evaluation. For example, will it require multiple visits per year to conduct observations? And does the person have time to do that? Then finally, I like to consider conflict of interest. Is this person objective? Or might they have a personal or a financial interest in a product or material? And I would assume that knowledge of a community and of your stakeholders is incredibly helpful and important as well. And so thank you all for your suggestions. I really think those are really helpful. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about where we might find an evaluator. If you're looking for one and you need an evaluation, obviously someone in your local community from a local college or university might be a great person to interview. And there's no reason why you can't just talk to someone, get a sense of who they are and what they can offer. Also, the American Evaluation Association, which most evaluators are aware of and are members of, has a wonderful tool called the Find an Evaluator tool. And that can help you search for people with expertise in a certain area or in certain locations. And then finally, what we all often do is we ask colleagues and others in our professional networks for recommendations, and that can certainly be very, very useful. So, in terms of hiring external evaluators, here's some advice from Joan LaFrance and Richard Nichols. In reframing evaluation, we encourage a strong partnering relationship between evaluators, program staff, and the community. We encourage external evaluators to facilitate a sense of partnership through respectful processes of community engagement. We also encourage evaluators to find opportunities to build capacity within the community as much as possible by including that community. For example, tribal college students in aspects of the evaluation, such as gathering data or assisting with the analysis. This piece spoke to me a great deal. I firmly believe in building the capacity of the community. And if an evaluator needs to hire data or research assistants or people to help with the project, it makes a very good deal of sense to hire people from the community, offer them the opportunity not only to make a little extra money, but to build their skills in this area. So that's why I really wanted to share that today. Because while I may have expertise in evaluation or someone else, the community members themselves have expertise of the program, the community, and what's most important about this program. I have certainly prepared evaluation questions in an overall approach that has been radically revised after working closely with the community, listening to that community, and better understanding what their needs and interests are. So I also want to share some resources around culturally responsive evaluation. So first of all, CREA is at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and its mission is to generate evidence for policymaking that is not only methodologically, but also culturally and contextually defensible. And it has several partnerships, including CREA Hawaii, which advocates for aloha-based evaluation and assessment practices. Then there's also YouthRex based in Ontario, Canada, and I've used their resources quite a bit. They include a logic model template and an evaluation toolkit. They also have webinars such as Indigenous Approaches to Youth Program Evaluation and Meaningfully Engaging Youth in Evaluation. And I used some of their work when I was designing some work at the University of Rochester to teach youth and to help develop youth skills in evaluation so that they could evaluate some segment of their community and then report out on their findings to the mayor of Rochester. And it was a really interesting piece of work in that community. And I felt that the youth grew so much by being involved in these evaluation projects. So I always like to encourage that along. Okay, so moving on. When you work with your evaluator to develop an evaluation plan, you have a lot to accomplish. You can see this list. You've got to be thinking about defining your program goals and objectives, asking good questions, creating a logic model, determining data sources, developing a data collection plan, thinking through a timeline, an analysis, and then the communication of findings. Don't depend upon your evaluator alone to develop and lead this. It should be a collaborative process. You will be much happier at the end if you are deeply embedded in that design process, making sure that the evaluation design meets your context and goals. So next, we're going to take you through the basic steps of program evaluation and give you some things to consider. So, sorry, I took a quick drink of water. Community engagement. So starting with community engagement, think about how you might want to involve your community. So here are some ideas. You could request community input on decisions related to the evaluation, such as the purpose, the questions, and the data to be collected. You can include community members as evaluation participants through focus groups, surveys, and interviews. And you can consider having community members review data collection tools or help collect that data and analyze it. We do have an Indigenous Evaluation framework, and I think we'll put a link to that in our resource section. And it has a really nice example of an evaluator who was engaged in a large evaluation of Aboriginal Head Start programs in Canada. And so they kind of kicked off the evaluation cycle with a community feast to announce this excitement around evaluation, to discuss the proposed purpose, to get lots of community members talking about that purpose, talking about the goals and questions, kind of, tweaking it and revising it and making it work for them. And the meeting was open and food was served and advice of those attending was sought. So there's a place where you can see that an evaluation can go from good to great, because now it's meaningful to those who are participating and they care about it. They want to be part of it. So next, we're going to talk about how youth can be involved in evaluation. As you know, this is something that I have a particular passion for, having worked with youth for many, many years. And Miranda's going to play a short piece of this video.
Conception within evaluation is that by merely having youth complete a questionnaire or perhaps engage in an interview as part of evaluation, then we're hearing their voice. And I think as a sector, we need to move beyond this and continue to involve them in different ways through the process. So what's really important to remember is that we want to move beyond seeing youth as subjects to being more intentional and meaningful, engaging youth throughout this entire evaluation process. And we can jump to the next slide and I'll share a continuum of youth engagement. So when we think about youth as more those notion of sources of data, so completing that questionnaire or engaging in an interview of sorts, that's where we look on this continuum as being somewhere virtually none or low engagement. So when we see engagement, it really does fall in that continuum, and we can kind of maybe have a look at that continuum and see where it is that we personally as an organization or in certain programs fall. So as we move from left to the right, we're seeing lower levels of engagement on the left, and as we move to that right hand side, we're seeing higher and higher levels of engagement in different ways that we can do that. So as a field, we generally sit somewhat fairly low in terms of where we use as more sources of data. But I think as a field, our goal is to increase this and move across the continuum to more that right-hand side of the continuum and involve youth at greater capacities and in different roles. So as mentioned earlier, youth engagement can and should take place across all aspects of the evaluation process. So When we think about having youth around the table, they should be around the table for evaluation planning, helping to co-develop evaluation questions, perhaps even working with program staff to develop or even refine a logic model or selecting evaluation tools.
Thank you very much, Corliss. I think that this is actually a fantastic spectrum to be as a tool for organizations working both in the youth sector and those who are simply trying to.
All right, I think our sound died there. But Miranda did put the link to that video in our chat. It is a great webinar. If it just inspires you to just think about your evaluation and where might we just involve youth, even in a small amount for our first year. And then maybe next year we think about how we can deepen their involvement. It gives them a chance to own and participate in the work of their schools and in the work of these grants. And I think that is so meaningful and so important. So that's why we included that little piece in case you haven't heard of them before. We wanted to make you aware of them. So thank you for that. And now I'm going to pass it over to Miranda, and she's going to talk about SMART goals.
Thanks,
The
Sherry.
most important things.
So I am going to start by talking about defining our program goals and objectives, because that's a critical first step before we really get into developing an evaluation plan and deciding what type of data we're going to collect and all of that good stuff. So you've probably already completed this part, although if you're a newer grantee, you might still be in the process of refining your objectives. We always encourage people to make sure that they are SMART. And by that, I mean they're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're relevant, and they're time-based. It's really worth the effort to take the time to craft solid SMART goals at the beginning, because it will make your work later much easier. You won't have to be going back and reading your goals and wondering, what did I mean, or how am I going to measure this? Because it will all be clearly stated in your goal. It's really important to communicate your program goals and objectives to your evaluator. You may already know how you want to measure a particular goal, but your evaluator might be able to provide input on that, or they might be able to help you develop the tools that you need for measuring them. It's also important to share background and contextual information with your evaluator to help them better understand your community, your program, and your goals. So Sherry briefly mentioned logic models earlier and mentioned that YouthRex has a great template. There are many different ones available. We picked a simple one just for the purpose of discussing the main components. A logic model is a very useful framework for organizing your goals and objectives once you have them, and helping you think about how you're going to achieve them. It can also help you focus your evaluation by thinking about what questions you want to answer, which aspects of your program you want to evaluate, and what types of information you want to collect. So again, this is just one example of a template. So let's take a look at the basic elements. We have inputs. What resources are you putting into the project? This can include human resources, such as your program staff and students and families, as well as other resources such as your supplies and materials. Then in this example, we have outputs broken into two categories. The outputs are the main things that the project will do or provide. So in this case, we have activities. As an example, that might be a native language elective course, and participation. For example, 120 students will participate for 6 weeks, 5 days a week. Then we have our short-term outcomes, and these are your SMART goals. For example, you might have one related to increasing proficiency in native language. And then we also have your longer-term outcomes. An example here might be that students increase their sense of identity and connectiveness to their culture. Your program might already have a logic model, or you can work with your evaluator to develop one. As Sherry was saying, it really works best when it's a collaborative process. You know your program and your goals and what should have that input, but then your evaluator can help you think about how you're going to measure these things and help you put this together. I'd like to share one more example of a different kind of logic model, and this again comes from the American Indian Higher Education Consortium's Indigenous Evaluation Framework by Joan LaFrance and Richard Nichols that we've referenced several times. It's a wonderful resource, and we can share the link to that too in case you don't have it. This is an example from the framework of a story modeling logic model that seems to be for some type of college and career readiness summer employment program. And it still includes the main components. You'll see you have activities at the bottom. They're going to identify and recruit employers, match and place students with employers. Then you start climbing up and have the short-term outcomes. Students complete their summer job assignments, demonstrate good work habits. Then keep climbing up to our longer-term outcomes. Work experience stimulates career awareness. So it's showing the same components, but as a picture instead that's, unique and relevant to their program. So again, I just want to emphasize that there are different ways you can create logic model. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the template that we showed. You can also get creative with it and use images as well. So after we've defined our program goals and outcomes and have put our logic model together, we can think about developing our evaluation questions. And that really helps us define the purpose and scope of the evaluation. There are a lot of different questions we should consider here. First of all, why are we doing this evaluation? Think about the purpose. Do you want to see if your program is effective? Are you looking to improve your program? Do you want to see if your program is being implemented as intended? Are you doing it for accountability purposes? What do we want to learn? Consider what you would like the evaluation to tell you at the end. What questions do you have about your program that you want answered? How will we use the results? It's helpful to think ahead about how you will use the results. Will you use them to complete your APR? Will you use them to inform program planning for next year? Think about what you would like at the end of the evaluation to be able to use. And what resources do you have available to carry out the evaluation? Considering your available resources and your budget will help you determine the scope of the evaluation and can influence your selection of data collection methods. These are all good questions to discuss with your evaluator as well as your larger program team, and the answers to them will help you determine the scope and method of evaluation. After we decide on our evaluation questions, we need to determine our data sources. Remember that your SMART goals might define some of these, that measurable part, but your evaluation questions might lead to others. For example, you might want to know whether your program is being implemented as intended, and you might have your evaluator develop a rubric or checklist for conducting program observations to determine that. So these are a handful of the types of data sources you might consider. Program documents. Document review can include a variety of things such as lesson plans and student work. Reviewing program documents can be helpful in ensuring fidelity of implementation regarding policies and procedures, or for comparing approved lesson plans and a recent observation. For example, are you aiming for teachers to implement a particular strategy? Also, assessments are a very common data source. These might be project created or standardized. This includes pre and post-project tests, assessments that are built into program tools, or informal assessments that are created specifically for the project or an activity. Observations can be really useful. They can be completed by a project director or non-school staff, or it can be a classroom observation done by a principal or other school leader. They give great qualitative data and can be used to measure fidelity of implementation regarding techniques and methods, participation, and engagement. Observations should typically be guided by a rubric or checklist. Interviews are another data source. These can be done with a variety of stakeholders such as staff, students, family members, depending on what information you're trying to gather. Again, it's important to use preset questions so that you can compare responses across groups and eliminate biases. Similarly, focus groups can be a great way to document feedback. This gives participants a chance to elaborate on responses and you to ask follow-up questions to really get at the information you're trying to get. Once again, it's important to create preset questions to guide, to help keep things on track. And it can also be helpful to have both a facilitator and a recorder. So you're not trying to both guide the conversation and listen as well as take notes. Lastly, surveys are one of the most common methods of gathering feedback regarding programs. Once again, they can be done with a variety of stakeholders, students, family members, project and other school staff. They're very useful for collecting information from a large audience, and especially for stakeholders who may not be easily accessible in person. They allow you to gather information regarding multiple areas in one tool. It's important to be cognizant of return rate when planning your survey. In our, if you were in our previous session on continuous improvement, we talked a little bit about survey burnout and the challenges of getting survey responses. And discuss the benefit of really narrowing down your survey to what you really need, trying to create 3 to 5 questions that really gets at the information you want, to try to collect more meaningful data and have people actually complete it. And Sherry gave what I thought was a great piece of advice, that before she sends out a survey, she takes it herself. And if she's getting bored taking it or it seems too long, then she knows her participants are going to feel the same way. Common free resources for online surveys include Google Forms and SurveyMonkey, and they have some different features that you can have fun with too and try to make them a little more interactive using images or star or heart ratings instead of just your typical multiple choice. So those are some different data sources to consider. While we're on the subject of data sources, I'd like to get a little bit into qualitative versus quantitative. So when we talk about data, I think a lot of people think of numbers first, things that can be counted, measured, and well quantified. One of the most common examples we see of this in education is test scores. Qualitative data, on the other hand, includes narrative, descriptive information. You may collect qualitative data through interviews, focus groups, or your notes from observations. But the important thing that both of these types of data have in common is that they should be systematically collected, recorded, and analyzed. So I'd like to open the chat box back up and hear what your thoughts and experiences are. Do you prefer one type over the other? What are the pros and cons of each? We'll give you a minute to share your thoughts on that. Amber thinks we should have a combination of both for the big picture. I agree with that. Both, Edwin agrees. I'll share my original background was more in the hard sciences, and I used to be very much a quantitative person, but it was getting into education that completely changed my mind and really won me over to the qualitative side. And now I'm very much a mixed methods person. So I will agree with you both. The numbers can be powerful and tell us a lot, but qualitative can get at some really richer stuff that we'll miss out on otherwise. Allison says she prefers qualitative. Chris adds qualitative data collection is easier. Quantitative can bring out things that are important to program planning. Marion also likes both. Ken makes a good point that at different times might call for one or the other. Oh, and Shauna adds a good point as well, that sometimes you can quantify qualitative data, which can be interesting. That's a good point as well. You might do a focus group, for example, and have lots of written description notes, and then you might do some coding to identify themes, and you might be able to quantify some of that. You know, 80% of people felt a particular way based on how you coded things. So feel free to keep chatting about the pros and cons of qualitative and quantitative. Thank you for sharing those. Okay, so after we determine our data sources, And we're thinking about what types of methods we're going to use. This is where we start developing our data collection plan. So once again, collaboration is important here. Your evaluator will need your input on factors such as when and how to collect the data to ensure that it's not disruptive to your program. And also note that your evaluator may not be responsible for collecting all the data needed for the evaluation. For example, you might have teachers complete an assessment and then provide that data to the evaluator. So when we're developing a data collection plan, we want to think about when that data will be collected, who's going to collect the data, how will the data be collected, do we need to develop any tools in order to be able to collect them, and what data will be collected. Then you can outline a timeline and tasks together again with your evaluator. This should include specific tasks that the evaluator will complete, which may include but are not necessarily limited to data collection activities, meetings with the program planning team, report due dates, and tool development. After we have collected our data, we get to the really fun part, analyzing it, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry to talk about that.
Thank you, Miranda. So most of you, I think, given some of your comments, have been involved in data analysis, which might be, production of statistical analyses and charts, as well as qualitative analysis, which might result in theme identification or case study description. So we like to always say, ask yourself what conclusions about the evaluation questions can be drawn from the data that have been analyzed. And at this stage, it can be useful to meet with your evaluator for them to describe their findings and give you a chance to poke some holes in their findings or ask good questions. And then we always like to suggest some other creative data analysis techniques that we've drawn from youthrex.com. The first is we call it like a graffiti wall. You can put paper up around your room. Let's say you want to get some feedback from youth on your program strategies or activities, and you can have youth going around the room for an hour, kind of taking markers and answering questions. And then you can revisit that as a group. It gives the youth a little bit of anonymity as they're responding, and then they can all see each other's responses, which is a lot of fun. And then I think I'll skip ahead at this point. I want to make sure we've got enough time for Susan. But clearly we want to be able to, communicate our findings in various ways to make sure that they meet the needs of our potential target audiences. So Miranda, I'm going to transfer it back over to you now.
Get unmuted. And we are going to get into our primetime event, our interview with Susan. And I think for this, actually, I'm going to stop sharing our presentation so that you can see us on camera. So hopefully that is working now. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. I'm wondering if you can start by just telling us some about what you view the role of program evaluation being, particularly in American Indian and Alaska Native education.
So thank you for that, Miranda. Before I get into that, both of you gave a lot of really thought-provoking information. And so I just had a couple of thoughts as you went through it. And one is you drew on the work of Nichols and Joan LaFrance. And I think that's critically important. One of the areas that I worked in before becoming a faculty member in higher ed was with tribal colleges and with the American Indian Higher Ed Consortium. And so Joan and Richard had worked intimately with the American Indian Higher Ed Consortium in the development of their work around Indigenous evaluation frameworks. And so I'm just really happy to see that you've referenced that work. And I would encourage all of the participants today to spend some time really delving in to the works by LaFrance and by Nichols. And then I would also add another person. Nicole Bowman is an Indigenous evaluator who does a lot of work. She works at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but she also owns her own Indigenous evaluation consulting group that does a lot of work in Indian ed and with Indigenous communities. And so I think those are really three great resources to draw on as you work to develop and implement your evaluation plans. But then as I thought about what you were presenting, I also thought about a quote from Bowman and her colleagues, Dodge and Tyndall. And there's a quote in an article that they wrote, or a chapter that they wrote, that says, evaluation must be ethical, it must be culturally sensitive, and it must be appropriate for the communities where it is conducted. And I'll say that again, that evaluation must be ethical, it must be culturally sensitive, it must be appropriate for the communities where it's conducted. And I think you can also, or we can also switch out the word communities, we can switch it out and use the word schools or organizations, because some of us may be doing work that's not firmly situated within an Indigenous community. It may be in an urban setting, it may be in a university, a college, tribal college, community college, or some other organization. But I think the key words there are being ethical in the way in which you design and implement an evaluation, being culturally sensitive. And I would also add being culturally aware, right? It's one thing to be sensitive. It's another thing to design and implement a plan that really is really aware, right? And that is appropriate for those communities or those organizations. And then I reflected on a quote by LaFrance, Nichols, and Kirkhart, and they wrote that context grounds all aspects of Indigenous evaluation. From an Indigenous evaluation framework, programs are understood within their relationship to place, to setting, and community. And evaluations are planned, undertaken, and validated in relation to cultural context. And I think that's critically important, because as I listen to you talk, and then I'll talk specifically about the role of program evaluation, but as I listen to you talk and present, I thought about my experience having been a project director. And so I co-directed and directed 2 personnel preparation grants at Penn State. And those grants were aimed at preparing American Indian, Alaska Native school leaders. And so we certainly had an evaluation component within that grant and within that program. But I thought about, our references to Indigenous evaluation, and then I thought about the APR that we're all required to submit. And as I think about those 2 different, one is a document and one is a framework, I think about the inherent contradictions between what we're asked and the way in which we're traditionally expected or required to report evaluation results in an APR, right? And I asked myself, to what extent does that form or that format lend itself to the implementation of an Indigenous evaluation framework? And so I know that there are members of OIE, who are probably part of this session today. And so that would be a question or a thought that I would pose for them is, I think for those of us who are Indigenous or work in Indigenous communities, it's critically important for us to be aware of and responsive to community, to cultures, to language, to place, to context. And that's difficult to do when you have a set evaluation report or template in which you have to report these findings or these data to your funding agency. And so I think when you ask what is the role of program evaluation in American Indian or Alaska Native education, my first answer was, in my role as a project director and as an evaluator, I think that the role of program evaluation is varied, depending on the context, again, the particular type of program or the particular kind of initiative or intervention that you're trying to implement. And so I think that it really behooves us to go into the development of a program evaluation, always centering those communities, those participants, and those desired outcomes, centering those things within the context of community and place and tribes and language. And then that helps us as we begin to develop and implement the evaluation plan. I think that, we oftentimes, and I was thinking about this and chuckling as the 2 of you presented and thinking, everything that I'm going to recommend that you do in a program evaluation, I have failed at that as a project director and someone designing an evaluation plan. And I think part of that is because my higher education training has been very Western focused, and I was taught to do evaluation in one very linear kind of way. And I think that what LaFrance and Nichols are arguing for is not a very linear model of evaluation. And they talk about this in some of their writings, and there's videos with Joan talking where she and also Nicole Bowman reference evaluation as being circular, or Indigenous evaluation being circular. And I think that's critically important for the project directors on this call to think about that, you know, evaluation doesn't always have to be linear, that sometimes you think about the end product and then you go back to what questions you're going to ask in order to be able to get at that end product. I think we also, one of the mistakes that I've made in program evaluation is thinking about it as an afterthought. It's something that I have to do because OIE or another funding agency requires it. And so I think about how much money is left over after I pay the teachers, after the participants are compensated, after we have the protocols, whatever it is that we're using. Okay, so there's $5,000 left. So I'm going to design an evaluation based off of $5,000. And I think that that's a mistake, right? I think that if we really want to do evaluation well, that we have to think about evaluation as not just being summative, but being a part of a formative process. And that evaluation begins at the beginning, right? As we're designing our programs, our interventions, our initiatives, that evaluation is at the core of that. Because otherwise it becomes an afterthought. And I'm not sure the extent to which it allows us to be able to respond to changing contexts, to be able to really emphasize our strengths, but also to engage in course correction if it's an afterthought. And then in my experience, program evaluation can be used to assist us in improving, in strengthening, and redesigning if needed. And it can help us to be more responsive to the needs, and not only the needs, but the desires and the demands of the communities in which we're working and the participants with whom we're working. And it can also help us to document our end results, our desired outcomes, our impacts. It can also show us our shortcomings, right? So that if we're going to write another grant, then we know the things that worked, the things that didn't work, what we need to do more of or less of. And I also think that finally, it can be used to help us think about sustainability. And so a lot of times in Indigenous communities, we're really dependent upon grant funding to be able to develop and implement and sustain programs or initiatives. And so I think we really need to think about evaluation as a way, as the two of you have already said, to be able to sell this initiative to future funders, to be able to not just have a short-lived initiative, but how do we grow this and how do we sustain it? And Miranda, I'll try to be shorter in my response to the next question.
I was just going to say, what an answer. I think you touched on a lot of other questions in that response. We have about 8 minutes left. So what I would love to do actually is open it up and let our audience ask you some questions. I just put a prompt in the chat box. If you have questions for Susan, please share them in there and we will pass them along to her.
We can also add some of the resources that we've mentioned today to our resource section of the Packable website so that you don't have to worry about trying to find them on your own.
We have one from Allison. What do you do if you find that a goal you were supposed to be achieving is actually not achieving what was initially proposed?
You know, and I would go back to Miranda and to Sherry to help answer that as well. I mean, I think that if you have a good relationship with your evaluator, that they can help guide you in being responsive to these kind of unanticipated occurrences. But I also think it's critically important to have a good relationship and ongoing conversation with your project officers at OIE. Because I think that oftentimes, and I've seen this happen a lot with evaluation plans, you have these really lofty goals and you're going to do all of these things. And then you get busy with the day-to-day life of your grant, or your evaluator becomes unavailable, or you don't have enough money. And so you have to change your evaluation plan. I think those are all things that we have to anticipate, and we have to be able to be responsive and flexible. And so I think it's critically important to have that ongoing conversation with your evaluator, because I think they can help you to problem solve. But also it's critically important to be in ongoing regular communication with your project officer so that they're aware of those unanticipated occurrences, and they can help you think about, okay, you're not able to achieve that goal, but here's how you can redirect resources into another goal, or here's how you can explain and contextualize that within your evaluation report.
Well, Susan, I couldn't agree more. And I often think about, having that conversation with your team. Like, why aren't we meeting this goal? Like opening it up to lots of brains. What is this about? And, why is this challenging for us? And how could, we tweak things to make things work differently? And I think thinking of your project officer as a member of that team is really, really important. So,
and I think, my experience working with OIE, and it's a long history going back, is that, their goal is to help your project be successful, because it's in their best interest for that project to be successful. And so they're aware of resources, they're able to help problem solve, and to just brainstorm with you. So I think if you think about it as a partnership, as opposed to these are just the people who funded you, then I think you're going to have a much more robust, impactful and successful, not just evaluation, but project.
Definitely.
We had Amber comment, really appreciating the visual of evaluation as a cyclical process. If you have questions for Susan, please pop them in the chat. In the meantime, maybe Susan, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience working with an external evaluator as a grantee?
So as I said before, I think as a project director, I probably did everything that you shouldn't do in terms of evaluation, because I wasn't thinking about evaluation in the way that I think about it now. I was thinking about it as this is something we have to do at the end, as opposed to thinking about how you involve that external evaluator or an internal evaluator as a part of the development of your proposal and the implementation of your project. And so I think whether I'm working with an internal or an external evaluator, if I were to be a project director in the future, I would think about evaluation throughout the process. I think that there's some pros and cons of working with external and internal evaluators. I think for me, when I review grant proposals, I'm always a little bit skeptical when it's an internal this is my own bias. I'm a little bit skeptical when there's an internal person evaluating the project, because I think that that person has a different stake in the project than an external person does. I also recognize there are limitations in resources or availability or expertise. And so I'm not saying never use an internal person. I'm saying I think there's pros and cons. I think there are also pros and cons with an external person, because you need someone who understands culture, the culture of the organization, the indigenous culture, the community, the context, the place. And I think if you read the work of of Nichols, and Joan LaFrance, they talk about that. Like, you need to make sure that that external or internal evaluator really understands context, and that they have trust and transparency at the forefront of what they're doing, and that they establish relationships. So I think for me, I've had good and bad experiences, and a lot of it is more on me of not fully investing the resources that I needed to invest in the design of the evaluation plan and in the actual implementation of it, whether it's internal or external evaluator.
I can say that as a primarily external evaluator, what I always want most is to get in there from the beginning, to really have the time to get a true understanding of this project, the people involved, their goals, and then help with that process. I have a strong desire to be helpful. But if I come in too late, then I just have to kind of check the boxes and do what they need to do for, their requirements. And that's not as much fun for anybody.
Right. And I think as you say that, I mean, it makes me think about, how you actually go about designing that evaluation, because I think oftentimes we think about the evaluator, whether they're internal or external, is going to design the whole evaluation plan. And I think if you look at those principles of Indigenous evaluation, it really calls for this co-construction of a plan. And so it may be members of your team working with that evaluator to develop and implement the evaluation plan. I think you two also raised the question about qualitative versus quantitative. And I think as someone who's a university researcher, I always am a little bit, I get a little nervous about that dichotomy between quantitative and qualitative. And I liked the participants' responses around using both, right? And so as a researcher, I think about the questions I'm asking first before I think about the methods. And so I think even in an evaluation, it should be the questions driving the method or the form of data that you're collecting. And so it may not just be qualitative or quantitative. It may be mixed methods. You may have a quantitative demographic section of your data collection, and then you may have the more descriptive qualitative interviews, focus groups. You also referenced the use of graffiti walls. And so I think about, and you've also mentioned doing work with youth. I think about work that I've done with youth and Indigenous youth in New Zealand, where we've used photo voice. So we've given them a set of questions and then taught them how to take photos, and they go out into the community and they take photos in response to those questions. Then there's text that accompanies those questions, but there's a really powerful visual that can be used. And I think about a colleague of mine did a project with a tribal Head Start program, and the program didn't have sufficient transportation. And so what they did is staff members in that Head Start program photographed a picture of the bus and superimposed a failed inspection sticker on top of that photo, and then showed that to tribal leaders. And a few days later, they had not one new bus, but several new buses, because those leaders could see the impact of not having a bus that met safety requirements. And so I think it's critically important not just to think about evaluation as a tool or a requirement of OIE, but to think about how the results of this evaluation can be communicated to multiple stakeholders, members of Congress, great other funding agencies, community members, parents, participants. And so it's really thinking about the questions and letting that drive, and the audiences, and letting that drive your evaluation tools.
Well, I hate to say it because I'm really enjoying listening to Susan, but we are at time. But first of all, I'd like to ask you all to do us a favor and take one final poll. It should be at the top of that poll tab. It's asking you to rate this session on a 5-star scale. We really appreciate your feedback on that so that we can engage in our own continuous improvement process. And the good news is that next up are our networking sessions beginning at 5:15 p.m. Eastern, and Susan will be joining us for that. So if you think of questions for her, we hope you will come back and chat more with us in a more informal setting. So thank you all so much for joining. We've really enjoyed having you, and hope we'll see some of you in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.